Hello and welcome back to the Librarian of the Rings. Today we're going to be talking about my thoughts on the Rings of Power Season 2, Episode 4. Welcome back, my name is Ben, I'm the Librarian. Today I want to talk to you about my thoughts on Episode 4. This was a weird episode for sure. It was not what I would call a normal Rings of Power episode, and there seemed to be a lot of really interesting things going on in here. Some people really liked this episode. Some people really hated this episode, which is not news. People always hate every episode of Rings of Power. But there were people that really liked it, and I kind of have gone back and forth on really liking some moments of it or really enjoying seeing some parts of it, and also not really liking it at all. It's very conflicting, I think, for a lot of people. So let's just talk a little bit about why. First off, I think this episode could have been called Things Peter Jackson Didn't Show in His Movies, because there are a lot of things in here that people wish they'd seen in the Peter Jackson films that did not make it there, and now we're seeing them in Rings of Power. What makes this weird is that Rings of Power is happening thousands of years ahead of The Lord of the Rings. And so to see these elements from The Lord of the Rings be brought in is a little bit jarring sometimes, but also it's not that weird because Tolkien did often tell things in mirror, right? Where something will happen early on, maybe in the first age, and then that will be mirrored in the second age and mirrored in the third age. Now, an interesting one of these is what the Rings of Power is completely based on, and that is there are these three jewels, the Silmarils, in the first age, and then there are the rings that are made in the second age. So technically the jewels weren't created in the first age, they were created before the coming of the sun, so during the ages of the trees, but the story of the Silmarils and the war that they bring about is a first age story. And then the story of how the rings come about is a second age story, but the war that they bring about, the last alliance of elves and men, ends the second age. And then of course there's the War of the Ring that they also bring about in the third age. There's always these parallels, so it's not that strange for there to be parallels. Tolkien, when he told stories, did these parallels a lot. You can see it throughout his writings. I've been reading through the history of The Hobbit right now, and the parallels between The Hobbit and the Father Christmas letters are really fascinating. So it's not that weird that there would be these parallels, but some of them are a little bit strange. They're fun to see on screen, but it's kind of odd. So let's start with the main one that most people probably caught right away, and that was Tom Bombadil. So Tom Bombadil famously not in the films, and there were probably good reasons that Peter Jackson and his team decided to do that, although it frustrated some fans, me included. I really think that the Tom Bombadil part of the story is important, and it just doesn't get shown in the films, which is too bad, but obviously there was a time crunch there. So Tom Bombadil gets brought into the Rings of Power, and that's cool. It's kind of fun to see him. Now, maybe they don't portray him exactly the way I pictured him, but they're doing a good job with him. What's weird is his location, and I've talked about this from the moment they kind of started showing images of Tom Bombadil. Having him in Rhûn doesn't make any sense. And in episode 4, they kind of just try to smooth that over. He says there used to be a forest there, which is now just a wasteland, and he had to come and see it for himself. He doesn't explain why he needed to stay in that wasteland for a long time. So hopefully we'll get more information on that. It is strange to have Tom be intervening. That's pretty counter to his character in the books. While it's interesting to see Tom on screen, I have these conflicting emotions about it. Also, the way they brought in the stranger and had him go through this tree swallowing like Merry and Pippin do in the books, that actually was in the extended edition of the Lord of the Rings films, but not with Tom Bombadil with Treebeard. So there's just kind of these mashups and weird things happening. And I do think there's probably some surprise on the part of movie fans who have only seen the movies and they go, wait, why is Treebeard's line, "Each earth dig deep, drink water," being given to Tom Bombadil?
Eat earth, dig deep, drink water.
When in fact, it's Tom Bombadil's line was given to Treebeard, and now it's being given back to Tom Bombadil. Speaking of his lines, they're doing something that's kind of fascinating. They're using a lot of his lines from the book. So they have him and the stranger have a conversation very similar to a conversation that he and Frodo has, so that they can use his dialogue from the Lord of the Rings books. But this kind of makes Tom seem like he's a person that just has the same conversations with people over and over again, and maybe that's true because the conversation is about who he is, and probably everyone he meets wants to know that. In fact, that's one of the biggest mysteries in all of Tolkien, is who Tom Bombadil is. Different people have different opinions on that. There's been a lot of speculation, but but because he never really explains it, it's not known. And so maybe he just has that conversation over and over again, and he's gotten to the point where he just uses the same words. So it's nice to hear him say his actual lines. It's weird to have him say them in this context, talking to the stranger. They also have him do just a little humming and a little singing, which to me is nice that they're bringing that in, but it seems like he should be a lot more boisterous. He is certainly more boisterous in the Lord of the Rings book. So as far as Tom Bombadil goes, the jury's still really out for me on this one. I don't know how his character is going to progress. I don't know if it's going to be good for the story. There's definitely differences here, and I hope what it causes people to do is go back and read the books and actually learn about Tom Bombadil's character in the books. Another thing that happens in episode 4 is the Barrow-wights. Now these in the book are closely related to Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil saves the hobbits from the Barrow-wights, and this was something that, again, cut from the film. Of course, they weren't going to show Tom Bombadil, and they cut the Barrow-wights out. And there's another moment here where movie fans might be like, wait, aren't there Smeagol lines going on here from the Lord of the Rings? And they're actually Barrow-wight lines being put back into the Barrow-wights, but a few of them were used by Smeagol in the Lord of the Rings. The Barrow-wights here are fighting the elves, and they aren't actually connected to Tom Bombadil, even though they're both in the same episode. This is a little strange, but it's interesting to see the Barrow-wights for sure. I kind of like that, and they did do a really spooky job on them. But this moment where one of the elves gets taken by the Barrow-wights and presumably killed, because there's like a little memorial for him after, that is a weird moment because we don't really know what the Barrow-wights are even trying to do with the hobbits. And then Elrond like pulls a sword out of the barrow, and it's like they can only be killed with swords that they were buried with. I guess that's an allusion to the barrow blades that the hobbits have, which the barrow blades were another thing that were cut from the film. Aragorn just like shows up with the swords, and we don't know where they came from or why they're important or anything. So again, we're getting these references to things that were not put in the films that are being put into Rings of Power. All right, the last kind of segment that I want to talk about here is back in Rhûn again. Nori and Poppy are separated from the stranger, and they encounter other hobbits. And what we're getting here from the books that we didn't get from the movies is the story of a group of hobbits that are oppressed by a dark wizard. So very famously, the Scouring of the Shire is really the last major event of the book before Frodo and the other ring bearers sail off to the west. And the Scouring of the Shire just completely absent from Jackson's films. And so we're getting this now. We're getting these Stoors who are hobbits, and they are being dominated by this dark wizard somehow. We don't have a lot of detail on that yet, but it seems like we're playing out a little bit of this storyline, and I would not be at all surprised to see some Stoor fighting scenes against these masked figures that are very similar to Scouring of the Shire, because they really seem to want to tell these stories but tell them in a Second Age context. I'm not sure how that's going to play out. It kind of depends on who that dark wizard actually is, what's actually under the masked men's face. Now, speaking of the masked men, I just want to point something out that kind of took me out of the story here. The masked men remind me a lot of Tusken Raiders in Star Wars. I mean, maybe it's because they're in a desert, they're wearing masks, and they're looking through spyglasses. Very similar to some Tusken Raider scenes that we've had in Star Wars. While the costuming overall, I think is really good in Rings of Power, I think they should have thought more about kind of what it would play into culturally and how we would be reminded of these Tusken Raiders, unless that's what they want us to be thinking about, which I'm not sure why they would. The whole kind of Hobbit storyline there is giving me some problems. Now, I'm not one of the people who hated the Harfoot storyline in season 1. A lot of people didn't like it. I actually did like it quite a bit. I found it fun and compelling, but Season 2 has definitely been difficult for me. I've already mentioned that when I talked about episodes 1 through 3, and it's not really getting any better. And one of the things here is they have so much leeway with these early hobbits because Tolkien didn't write that much about them. So it's a little frustrating when they choose to do the opposite of what he did say about them, okay? And this would be the Stoors living in holes when the Harfoots don't. And specifically, he says that the Harfoots were the ones who kept on living in holes. Let me just give you a passage from the book here. This is about the Harfoots. They were the most inclined to settle in one place and the longest preserved their ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. So the Harfoots show up and they're surprised to see the Stoors living in tunnels when in fact they're the ones who longest preserved that. So we need to see the Harfoots come back to living in tunnels. Now, it really seems like they're setting up the founding and finding of the Shire, and so maybe we'll see them kind of return to holes there. It also says that they were the most to settle down in one place, where they've shown us the Harfoots to be the most migratory. So it seems like maybe if they had just switched the terms and had the Stoors be the ones that we met in season 1 and the Harfoots be the ones that we're meeting in season 2, maybe that would have been better. It doesn't make a ton of sense. So again, jury's still out on all of this, but I did find episode 4 to be, at points, very fun to see things depicted on screen that we've never seen depicted on screen before, and at points frustrating. I know this sounds a little bit negative. I tended to be pretty positive on this show, and I'm still positive on it. I'm still enjoying this show. I enjoyed episode 4, and I still think it's fun to have these new adaptations of Tolkien being done. I don't hate them, and all I want to do here is just kind of give my thoughts and point them out, and help to point you towards some things that you can read to get a grasp for what Tolkien said at different points about these things. So for the history of the Hobbits, you want to read concerning hobbits in the prologue to the Fellowship of the Ring. So make sure you grab that and read through that if you want to know more about them. For knowing more about the wizards, you want to read the essay on the Astari, which is found in Unfinished Tales. That can tell you more about the wizards, and particularly you can find out what little there is to be known about the blue wizards, which definitely seems to be the setup between the Stranger and the Dark Wizard, is that they're taking on blue wizard roles even if they give them other wizard names. Now, if you want to know more about Tom Bombadil, you're going to be back in the Fellowship of the Ring. You're going to be reading in the chapters on the Old Forest and in the House of Tom Bombadil, which will tell you a lot more about him. And then of course you're going to go on to the next chapter, which is going to be Fog on the Barrow Downs, where you're going to learn all about the Barrow-wights and the hobbits' encounter with them. So again, just reading some of these things can give you better context for what Tolkien was thinking, and that can help you to make up your own mind about the Rings of Power. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Go down in the comments, let me know what you thought about episode 4. As always, because the Rings of Power is controversial, I will be moderating all of those comments to make sure that only the appropriate ones go up where you can read them. All right, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, farewell wherever you fare. May your ears receive you at your journey's end.